When Daniel the Ogeredigion, the Reverend Daniel Evans, Fellow of Jesus College, Oxford, and alumnus of Eliezer Williams's grammar school here at Lampeter, wrote a poem celebrating the laying of the foundation stone of this college in August 1822, he lists and praises various heroes for their contribution to the foundation. Among them were King George IV, after all, 12th of August was his birthday, Bishop Thomas Burgess, above me here, Eliezer Williams, J.S. Harford, over there, Archdeacon Thomas Bynon, and Jones of Derry Ormond. And they were ranged alongside heroes of the ecclesiastical Welsh past, David, Dyfrig, Dynawd, Patrick, and Illtyd. There's one name which isn't there. So when he came round to writing verses to celebrate the actual opening of the college in 1827, by that time, Bishop Burgess had been succeeded by Bishop J.B. Jenkinson, and now there is one other name in Daniel Evans's pantheon. Not just a mention, he's got 4 whole verses to himself. The poem is a bit ropey, it's a bit doggerelish, it's not as good as the early one. It tends to be a bit tum-to-tum, really, but there we are. And Daniel Evans refers to his long acquaintance with this person. They'd overlapped at Jesus College, Oxford, and he exhorts him to encourage any young man showing gifts for Welsh poetry, and not just poetry, because Evans was convinced that the college would be a place to study the Welsh language and more. It was to be a beacon of hope for the language and a defeat for all those who are opposed to it. He hoped that Llewelyn would have good health, we'll return to that later, and would gain fame. Daniel, of course, was talking about the personage immediately above me in his DCL gown, the Very Reverend Dr. Llewelyn Lewellin. The portrait is by H.W. Pickersgill, who was, of course, one of the go-to people for if you wanted your portrait painted. He's not wearing gaiters, as far as I can see, and his doctoral status is clear in his DCL gown. And actually, it's the wrong gown or the wrong pattern of the wrong color. The scarlet is all right, but Pickersgill clearly used the more modern version with a dark red rather than the pink. And of course, the DCL has a Tudor bonnet. It doesn't have the mortarboard, which Llewelyn is holding. In fact, the contrast is quite clear here. The one on my right is the DCL gown given to J.S. Harford when he was awarded the degree in Oxford. And that is, in fact, as we'll see later, what Llewelyn himself wore all the way through. So this is Llewelyn. In 1827, Daniel Lee links him to the college, to Lampeter, and to Welshness. And we also need to recall, of course, that he wasn't just the first principal. He was here for 51 years, from 1827 to 1878. And also, for much of that time, the vicar of Lampeter from 1833 to 1878, and from 1840 to 1878, he held these in plurality. He was, yes, the first dean of St. David's, but he was appointed a couple of months earlier in the 1840s as precentor of St. David's, and that is what he stayed at. And in fact, his obit makes that clear. He still remained under the old foundation. He wasn't, in fact, taken up by the ecclesiastical commissioners. If you were a student here and you wanted a copy of that portrait, this is what you got, the engraving by Maguire. I think there are copies of this in the archive. So are you still selling them? But there we are, sorry. That might be useful in the present circumstances, and I haven't said that. Now, the combination of offices alone at that period makes Llewelyn a person of interest. So who was Llewelyn?
You're going the wrong way.
Sorry. I've never known my left hand from my right hand, is it obviously? Yes. There we go. And that is the carving of him in the parish church at Lampeter. Bishop Thirlwall wearing a mitre, which he never did, is at one end of the arcade, and here is Llewellyn on the other. And I think actually it's based on the portrait. Well, this will be a sidelong glance, because in looking at him, I found there's far more material than I thought. He didn't keep a journal, as far as is known, but his daughter, Mrs. Emily Nares, there she is, wrote a memoir, Pleasant Memories of Eminent Churchmen. And of course, it's not dated, but an advert in the Pembrokeshire Herald in about 1907 says she'd written it to support the anti-disestablishment campaign. And obviously, Canon William Price, in his outstanding history of Lampeter, has much to say about Llewellyn. But he does actually figure quite often and quite prominently in the newspapers of his day, in the context both of college, parish, town, neighbourhood, and diocese. We hear his authentic voice as he sat on the magistrate's bench. He participated in local government and also supervised the affairs of the college. There is also, as you might expect, reference to him in the chapter books of St David's Cathedral, and obviously there's a lot of material here in the Roderick Bowen archive. And of course, I'm not going to go into this, I've just published this. There was an extraordinarily vituperant pamphlet exchange between him and Nathaniel Davies, who was among the first students here in 1827 who became minor canon and headmaster of the Cathedral Grammar School. Now, amongst all this material, there is several references to Llewellyn which are not as complimentary as the ones in Daniel Lee's poem. Quite a few of those happened in his own lifetime, others from 3/4 of a century or more after his death, and by his successors as principal, were equally condemnatory. He was judged for his stewardship of this college. He was judged fiercely for not developing the idea of a Welsh university based on St David's College. There's a correspondence about him between members of the chapter of St David's Cathedral, characterized by rising concern and deep exasperation, if not rage, especially during the period in the run-up to Gilbert Scott's restoration of the building in the 1860s. Many others, a substantial group, judged him very harshly for his perceived deficiencies in Welsh and his attitudes towards Welsh. So I've chosen some examples of those to get the bad news out of the way at the beginning. I'm not avoiding the facts. I have to say, the more I've gone into looking at Llewellyn, I would like to have known him. I would certainly like to have been taught by him, because he was renowned as one of the great Grecians of his day in Wales, but I would certainly not have wished to work with him. But I want to make the point at the outset that examining his background, his context, his contemporaries, we get that fuller and, I think, fairer picture of his time as the principal of this college, as the vicar of Lampeter, and of his time as Dean of St David's, all of which, of course, he held simultaneously. So I see him not as a Victorian failure, which most people do. He is as a successful surviving Hanoverian. Among the criticisms of Llewellyn, we find one from the 1950s. St David's College, its past, its present, and its future, compiled by the then principal H.K. Archdale with the assistance of Archdeacon, as he became, Ron Tree. Archdale says, "Candour forces me to admit that the long reign of 50 years of the principal was not good for the college." And he singles out the vice principals, Ollivant, Brown, and Roland Williams, for praise, while condemning Llewellyn for a foolish readiness to carry on without a constitution, for irresponsible administration, and that Welsh did not become part of the degree course until 1887. Another person to criticize him was his second vice principal, Harold Brown, above me there on the left. And in a remarkably candid letter, It survives as a draft to Bishop Conor Thirlwall, who of course wasn't just the Bishop of St David's, and Thirlwall is behind us, he nominated there in his niche. He was also the visitor to the college, so should have been more responsible. And Thirlwall did reply to him here on the 17th of July, 1848. Brown had been here since 1843 when Ollivant went to a Cambridge chair. Brown expressed anxiety about the college's survival and therefore his own and his family's future. He said, I am committed to Lampeter, but I'm worried that this new collegiate institute at Llandovery has opened. That was in March 1848. There springs up at Llandovery not a school, but, and he quotes, an institution between a grammar school and a university. Now, the anxiety is understandable. Thomas Phillips, major patron, generous benefactor of this college, had turned to founding Llandovery because he'd failed to persuade the Lampeter College authorities, i.e. Llewelyn, to accept his endowment for a chair of Welsh. Now, both institutions, Llandovery and here, had the same visitor, namely Conor Thirlwall. So Brown's anxiety is understandable, and you can see why he wrote to him. Now, that anxiety had increased after Brown and Llewellyn had gone to Llandovery to examine the top class in classics there, and had been very impressed by the very high standards attained. And in the public meeting afterwards, Brown had expressed the hope that Llandovery would act as a feeder to Lampeter. Not very tactful, really, but even though that had not been the original intention. And Thirlwall's reply makes that point, and he assures Brown there was no similarity between the institutions, and please do not leave Lampeter, he says to Brown. But that wasn't all. Clearly at the same time, Brown had been sharing his concerns with Archdeacon North, the professor of Latin. And at that point, I think there were only 3 major members of staff here. And Brown wrote to Llewellyn. And this is a very sharp letter indeed. I think that he and North had come to the conclusion that the chief obstacle to the reform of this college was the principal. And he says the college was, and I quote, out of favour with the clergy and most of all with the gentry in Wales. Unless change happened, and soon, then the college might as well close and leave the field to Archdeacon John Williams. He brought to Llewellyn's attention 2 relevant matters: the inefficiency of examinations, and that the college accepted unqualified men. There was a need to appoint external examiners. There clearly weren't any. Secondly, fees should be reduced. Education at Lampeter was too expensive. And one reason for that was that the affairs of the college are all administered by one, and that the most, if I can just well in mind, the most irresponsible member of it, that the principal is at once tutor, bursar, steward, and even farmer and butcher, and that the accounts are not sufficiently public. Devastating and damning, I would have thought. And more, Brown adds that since he'd come to Lampeter, he'd felt that, and I quote, the kind of personal control exercised in the college was inconsistent with the constitution of a corporate body, unlike any other college in the kingdom. But I have to point out that Archdeacon Thorpe was a sort of Llewellyn equivalent in Durham, also faced the same kind of criticism. And Brown, in another letter, insists that the college should be put on the same administrative basis as the new university colleges, and that the accounts should be published. Moreover, there should be a board, there wasn't one, which should meet regularly to administer the college. And I think we should also remember that at this time, late 1840s up to the 1850s, there were moves, of course, to reform the 2 ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And Willie Price makes this point, that Llewellyn can be seen as a representative of the unreformed university, of which, of course, he had been master of the schools. Brown was less polite. He compared Llewellyn's methods to those of a master of a common grammar school. There was also an issue, and this would come back later, regarding the way Llewellyn was administering college scholarships. The sharpest blow came when Brown commented that, I quote, "I may add that one of the greatest causes of public indignation is that you provide for the college from your own farm. Whatever the advantages that may accrue from this, it is so very unpopular a thing that I cannot but hope you will give it up." And Llewellyn did. According to the Welshman, in October 1845, he held an auction of stock. Remember, he was a farmer's son from a long line of farmers. He knew what he was doing. And it's worth noting that it is not his personal farm. It's the vicarial glebe of the parish of Lampeter, where the Bryn and Bryn Road is now. He held that, of course, as vicar. And to be fair, Llewellyn appears to have taken Brown's criticisms on board. There was now a board to run the college. That is why, of course, there are no minute books or documentation about the early years of the college, because there wasn't a board in 1850 and people actually started keeping minutes. Now, the new vice principal, Brown, actually had been offered and accepted the living of Kenwyn in the Diocese of Exeter. The new vice principal was Rowland Williams. Now, at first, things seemed to have gone well. He was a doughty defender of Lampeter, especially against the strictures of John Williams. In fact, Rowland Williams was quite rude about the standards in Llandovery. He had, of course, been the Classics Fellow in King's Cambridge. But by 1860, the relationship had soured. Llewellyn had, as we, I think, politely could say, had adjusted the college rules in order to accommodate his younger son, George, both in residence and in examination. He changed the syllabus to suit George. Now, I must also say, had Rowland Williams been my vice principal, I would have loathed him, because he had no common sense at all. What he did, in anger, he not only wrote to Conor Thirlwell as a visitor, but he published the letter in the press. And he complained that Llewellyn had changed the course to favour George, who'd been a member of the college and then withdrawn from the college, attended his father's lecture, then was brought back in with the course to suit him, and had been entered for the exam and awarded a scholarship over the head of one who had better marks than him. Llewellyn did write to the papers pointing out that George's health was weak and he had been ill for most of the term. Now, of course, that year, 1860, is a crucial one. It saw the publication of essays and reviews of biblical criticism, which saw Williams's condemnation for heresy in the Court of the Arches. The verdict, of course, overturned later by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. But Williams had earlier published his sermons, Rational Godliness, and that publication had led Alfred Ollivant asking him to resign as his bishop's examining chaplain in Llandaff, and a condemnation in a visitation charge of 1857 for spreading heretical views. Now, Williams's widow, which not really spell out the name, but it's fairly clear who she means, thought it was Llewellyn who was behind this, not least out of jealousy, because Rowland Williams had had a Cambridge DD, and the college had turned out and made a big fuss and welcomed him. I think personally it was prudence, again, if I'd been Llewellyn, because the effect of having a heretic on your staff wouldn't help admissions, would it? And that was the main reason. Anyway, Williams resigned his Lampeter post in 1862, and then he retired to a King's College living of Broad Chalk, which he had held anyway, you see, since 1858. He's a pluralist too. And he's died there and was buried there in 1870. And Llewellyn refers to Williams's resignation in a letter to his nephew Charles on the 18th of February, 1862. Now, from the shadows of what I've been saying, both Llandovery and the name John Williams and Welshness have haunted this discussion, and they're linked. It is quite obvious that a great number of people in Wales were worried about the commitment to Welsh and indeed the status of Welsh in this college. From the very beginning, actually, before, in fact, it was meant to be here, because it was meant, as you know, to be at Llandovery Revd. On the 9th of November 1830, and I haven't come across a portrait of Thomas Finan, and I wish I could find one. Archdeacon of Cardigan, agent to the Earl of Corder, one of the original patrons of St David's College, named by Daniel Lee in 1822, wrote to Thomas Burgess, who by then, of course, was Bishop of Salisbury, complaining that Llewellyn had gone to the archidiaconal meeting in Carmarthen in October 1830, so that he could lean on Finan, not a wise thing to do, in the direction of opening the Burton Scholarship to the English as well as the Welsh students of the college, contrary to Finan's wishes. Finan became very angry, and he did tend to pooty quite often. He changed his mind about bequeathing to the college the rich living of Tally, worth £500 a year, leaving £2,000 or £3,000 in addition to the college to endow a chair in mathematics. And he had made that point, fair play to Burgess, way back in the opening decades of the 19th century, and also 2,000 or 3,000 books to the college library. And I quote, "I shall give them neither living, underlined, money, underlined, nor books, underlined." And in the same connection, of course, Thomas Phillips, one of the chief patrons here, after his unsuccessful attempt in March and April 1847 to endow the revived chair of Welsh, changed his mind. The college, having disappointed his expectations, he determined to found a new institution in Llandovery, which opened in 1848. And it's interesting that one of those backing this new foundation was William Rees, the printer of Ton in Llandovery, who of course was the brother of the first professor of Welsh here at Gleis, Rees. Now that chair, of course, the Welsh chair, had remained vacant after Rees's untimely death in 1839. But we also note at the same time that Phillips didn't pooty. He kept his support for Lampeter. Now, I have to say, in a way, reading the correspondence, I don't blame the authorities at Lampeter for turning Phillips down, because there's another name which is haunting this discussion, and that is Lady Llanover. And she has been called fairly frequently an interfering busybody. She wrote on the 31st of March, 1847, to the Reverend David James, Welsh exile, Vicar of Kirkdale, of course involved with that group of Welsh clergy exiles, the Association of Welsh Clergy in the West Riding of Yorkshire, offering him the chair. And she tried to influence Connaught Thirlwell, whom she disliked, to assist her not only by getting James appointed, but also in proposing that 5 undeniable Welsh scholars, one from each diocese with 2 for this diocese, be appointed as trustees, benefit clergymen, with the authority, and I quote, to discharge any professor who does not carry out the object of Welsh instruction. She had no connection whatsoever with this college. And I wonder what Principal Llewellyn made of this. For in her eyes, and I quote, "He hates Welsh in his heart and ruins the college. The principal must be fought by the bishop." And Lady Hall has now a correspondence with the bishop going on. Breathtaking arguments, but it is entirely typical of Lady Llanover. As we noted, Phillips went ahead and founded Llandovery. Now, Llewellyn was also criticised, especially by Ewan Morgan in his 1929 MA thesis, for failing to create a university for Wales based on Lampeter. Morgan described Jenkinson, his successor as a bishop, not of being the same caliber, and he condemns Llewellyn as one who should never have been made the college's first principal. And I quote, and it is a litany, "A more incompetent, inefficient, irresponsible, or autocratic person than Dean Llewellyn could never have been chosen as the first principal of the college. His period of office was one long term of maladministration, and to such an extent did he succeed in alienating the clergy, the gentry, the staff, as well as the country as a whole against the college, that it was brought to the very edge of extinction." First warden of Llandovery was John Williams, Archdeacon of Cardigan. Remember that in this diocese until the 1850s, the archdeacons exercised no archdiaconal powers at all. But on the 10th of February 1852, he wrote to Sir Benjamin Hall, Lady Clover's husband, and it was at the time that this college was with the backing of the Welsh bishops, or at least of St David's and Llandaff. They were seeking to secure degree awarding powers to Lampeter, and of course, looking for money to replenish college funds. Williams, who in the same letter was expressing a fervent desire that he might be able to establish at least one seminary of sound and efficient learning in Wales before his death, went on to say that conscientiously, and I quote, he believed that it had been a blight and a curse upon the spiritual and intellectual energies of the Principality, and to have been the slaughterhouse of the rising talent of my country. That's Williams about Lampeter. He would not hesitate to demand a public inquiry into the past, present, and likely future of Lampeter. Given its past inefficiency and corruption, it should not be allowed any additional powers. Now, of course, he was as Archdeacon of Cardigan, the sub-visitor of the college, but he just complained he'd never been allowed near. I wonder why. And Williams, as we shall see, had history where the college was concerned. Now, lastly, as I said, there was Llewellyn's relationship with his chapter as precentor and dean of St David's. He faced criticism here too, not least by his chancellor, the Reverend Sir Erasmus Henry Griffiths Williams, who was by every account a difficult man. In fact, Gilbert Scott in his journal makes remarks about Griffiths Williams, so it wasn't just Llewellyn. But he accused Llewellyn of being obsessed with money and refusing to take necessary decisions regarding the parlour state of the fabric of the cathedral, and that is actually true. I think Llewellyn realised how much it would cost and backed off. But Llewellyn and his family spent the summer vacation every year in residence at the cathedral, at the deanery, which he had rebuilt, and sometimes Easter and Christmas too. And as I mentioned earlier, he was castigated fiercely by one of his minor canons, Nathaniel Davis, for diversion of school or funds, as Davis saw it, from the school into the pockets of the dean and chapter, and for his neglect of the fabric, especially the tower. He does say that Llewellyn's answer to the leak that was pouring into the north transept was to send a carpenter up with a drill a hole so the water came down on the floor and didn't go into the, you can see why it costs what, 30,000 to do the repairs. It led, of course, to a Trollopian pamphlet war, which I published in the State of Menevia recently. It's unbelievable. And it's interesting in that sequence of pamphlets to note the computation by Davis of Llewellyn's income as dean, precentor, and vicar of Lampeter. Now, he'd actually remained on the old foundations. He was getting nowhere near that. Problem was, Davis had been appointed just after the Act of Change, and he was getting nowhere near what the Act, what he should have got, £150 a year under the Act. Well, when the restoration of the cathedral did commence, it was a matter of necessity, and it was under Llewellyn's watch. It began in 1865. His daughter, in her memoir, says he was responsible for it. Most other people disagreed. There's one photograph which is very, very revealing. The site meeting of the restoration of the west front of the cathedral as a memorial to Conor Thurwall. It's usually captioned by saying St David's before the restoration. Rubbish. The tower has been done, transept has been done, and what we've got here is the site meeting in front of the Nash West front of 1793. It was going to be redone as a memorial to Bishop Conor Thurwall, and in fact it was Thurwall who had started the ball rolling by chairing the public meeting in Carmarthen in 1863, and he had also refused to allow a legacy of £2,000 just to be sunk on various general repairs. We're going to do it, we're going to do it properly, and he got all the gentry and the bigwigs involved. Now, Basil Jones is there. Basil Jones is Yeah. E.A. Freeman, famous Victorian history of the cathedral courses, Jones and Freeman. That is James Allen, the then Chancellor, later the Dean, who out of his own pocket paid for most of the restoration. And here is Sir Gilbert Scott himself. It's one of the last pictures of Scott because he died fairly soon afterwards. And also, I always forget it, he's the most important person. Hiding around the corner is Mr. David Morgan, the mason. And really the work was done there in the 1860s is big skills. He was from St. Devereux in Herefordshire. Who isn't there? Well, if I'd been in, I would have been there. Llewelyn is not there. It is quite humiliating, actually, but also his health was not good at the end of his life. And of course, he may still, in April, the 22nd of April, 1876, that they met, he may have been here. So is there another side, a less condemnatory side of view of Llewelyn? I've come to think so. Last, by asking who he was and where he was from. There is on the restored ceiling of the presbytery in St. David's Cathedral, it commemorates those members of chapter who were in post during the existence of the 1865-1873 Restoration Committee. Bishop Thirlwell is there, Llewellyn is there. And the slide shows a shield with his and his wife's arm. She was the daughter of George Smith of Boylaft, a relative of the Earls Carrington, but the colours here differ. Now, it's his that you need to look at, which is on the left-hand side that you're looking, the right-hand side, of course, the dexter side of the shield. And his arms appear to be an adaptation, so Professor Priest Morgan tells me, of the Maliphant arms, once a Glamorgan family of consequence. Ghoul, a lion rampant sable, and a bend oar. There's no evidence, as far as I can see, that Llewelyn ever used that. And the heraldic experts among you will be rushing to tell me, of course, it's wrong. Of course it's wrong. You never put colour on colour, or metal on metal. And in fact, what you've got there is black on red. Now, there was also a link between Llewelyn and the family of Traherne of Coedrignan. And in fact, that big legacy was GGT Traherne and his coat of arms, unpainted, and on the roof of the North Transept. And also the gentry family of the Davids in Glamorgan. But there's one interesting thing. Llewellyn's grandfather, problem is there were 4 or 5 Richards in succeeding generations, but this is his grandfather, Richard Llewellyn, could not sign his name, but he made his mark on his marriage certificate. Now, Llewellyn, it was a family name. Llewellyn, of course, the spelling is such, there were several families called Llewellyn in Glamorgan. And of course, as you know, when Ollivant was made Bishop of Llandaff, a big thing was made of the fact he could speak Welsh. But the person who wrote the article strongly disagreed and said, what can you expect? How can he speak Welsh when he's been working with a person who can't even spell his own name? And quite gratuitous. He was born on the 3rd of August, 1798, in remains in Coity. I think the house is actually still there as a guest house in Bridgend. The 3rd son of Richard Llewellyn, farmer, yeoman really, but a tenant of Lady Charlotte Edwin on the Dunraven estate. But his mother was Maria Alicia, daughter of the Reverend David Jones, the rector of Llangan, the leading evangelical cleric of his day. There he is. He was prominent in the Methodist movement and linked to the Countess of Huntington, and through her with Lady Charlotte Edwin, who was the patron, and appointed David Jones to Llangan in 1767. Now, Jones himself, minor gentry, had married Zina Bowen, a member of the gentry family of Wynevor in Maes y Crygiau, not far from here. And her nephew, Daniel Bowen, was both squire of Wynevor and vicar of Llanllwni, an 18th century sparson indeed. And that's the context in which I see Llewelyn. Now, his sister Frances, who kept house for him here before he was married, married the Reverend Thomas Lloyd, the Squire of Gilfachwen, and the Vicar of Llanfairpwllgwyn. And yesterday, looking for something else, I actually discovered his other sister had married the Reverend William Rees, who's the perpetual curate of Ystrad y Fodwg. And their children and grandchildren had the name Llewelyn in all the way through. Now, he went to Cowbridge Grammar School at 13, after, according to Dr. Roger Brown, attending a school kept by the Reverend Richard Bassett at Cowbridge. Now, Cowbridge Grammar School, of course, was wholly owned by Jesus College, Oxford. And it's not surprising, therefore, that Llewellyn matriculated at Jesus in 1818. But he wasn't one of the 5 monitors, they would know, who were expected to go on to Jesus and also usually ended up as fellows. Nevertheless, in 1821, he obtained a scholarship which he held until 1826, and he decided to try for honours, and under the tutorship, and it cost him £100, mind, of Richard Bethel, later Lord Chancellor Westbury, he gained a first in Greats in 1822. One of the first 3 to do so from Jesus, all 3 of them from Cowbridge Grammar School. And, given what people said later, he won a prize for Welsh at Jesus. And of course, that's when he came into contact with Daniel Lee, who's a fellow of Jesus. He didn't gain a fellowship, but he was made deacon in 1822, priested in 1823 by the Bishop of Oxford to a title of his scholarship. Not attached to any parish, but did Sunday duty as needed, took his MA in 1824, became master of the schools, responsible for examinations in the university, and he took private pupils. And he said he was better off when he did that than after he'd come here. Among whom, of course, was Rice Rees, who became the first professor of Welsh and Latin in this college. Now, the scholarship was due to run out in 1826, and he was looking to the future. And he applied for, was interviewed, and obtained the post of headmaster of Broughton Grammar School in Somerset, now the King's School, Broughton. But in June 1826, he was offered the principalship of St. David's College, Lampeter, by J.S. Harford, acting on behalf of Bishop Jenkinson. So he withdrew from Broughton and accepted this post. In fact, he was succeeded at Broughton by one of the great Victorian headmasters, Hoskins Abraham. He was 28 years old. And his vice principal, Alfred Ollivant, was also 28 years old, but 3 weeks younger. Now, it has to be said that he was not Bishop Burgess's first choice in 1822. After all, it's only in that year he took his BA. Had Eleazar Williams been alive, then I think, in my view, Burgess would have appointed him. And Burgess had supported the grammar school here, one of the 8 licensed grammar schools from which he would ordain before this place was founded. And Williams, of course, was headmaster. Daniel Lee and Rice Rees had been his pupils. And Eleazar Williams and Burgess had discussed with each other the nature and the needs of ordination training. According to his son, George Armstrong Williams, it was Williams who persuaded Burgess of the absolute need of Welsh medium education in this diocese and in this context. The second candidate whom Burgess had in mind was the Reverend W.J. Rees, the Vicar of Cascoll. Graduate of Brasenose College in Oxford, he refused because, although he was an acknowledged scholar in Welsh and a supporter of the Eisteddfod, he thought he'd been out of full-time education for too long. And it's interesting, therefore, it was his nephew, Rice Rees, who came to Lampeter. And the Ton correspondence survives in the West Glam Record Office. Between the two Reeses furnishes invaluable evidence of the conditions, sort of more or less disorganized shambles of the early years of this college. And note that Rice Rees, unlike Llewellyn, was BCL in 1827 and DCL in 1829. Rees was a fellow of Jesus College, as was Daniel Lee, and Rees was a Bachelor of Divinity to boot. I did raise this with the archivist in Jesus of why Llewellyn hadn't taken a BD and a DD. Well, of course, it was cheaper, probably quicker him to get the BCL or DCL. Now, the third person, and to me and to everyone else, really, the most obvious candidate to be the first principal here was John Williams. And so you can see faces like that in North Cardigan from Mars, you know, and that I think is a key to Williams, is because, as you know, the original intention was to beef up St Mary, and the Williams family said no. Clearly, they're making too much money out of it. And it was John Williams' brother David, who was the other son of himself, who was running St Mary in the 1820s. Now, Williams, having been taught by his father in St Mary, took a first-class honours in Greats in Balliol. And he was acknowledged in his generation as being one of the outstanding teachers, not just in Britain, but in Europe. Now, he taught at Winchester College, whence he was attracted from there, he was attracted by Burgess to succeed Eleazar Williams on the latter's death as headmaster of Lampeter Grammar School. He was also, like Eleazar, vicar of the parish. And it was by virtue of being vicar of the parish that, irony of ironies, in 1822, it was he who preached in the parish church at the opening of this college. And he preached on Malachi 2:7, the lips of the priest should guard knowledge. But he didn't become principal. It's said that he and Burgess disagreed about the purpose of the college. Williams wanted it to be more of a theological college. And that's, in fact, Mrs. Nares, in her memoir of her father, calls it a theological college, which it never was. Burgess, I think, wanted a place to provide a general classical education for those who couldn't go to Oxbridge because of cost and distance, though he too referred to Lampeter as a seminary. And as I've said elsewhere, the syllabus which Burgess published in 1816 was comprehensive and massively daunting. I did the Old Wales postgraduate BD, and I found it daunting. When you think it's for 18-year-olds who hadn't been in a grammar school, it's absolutely impossible. Whatever was in Burgess's mind, I have to say, I do not find it clear exactly what he had in mind. Was it something close to a degree awarding institution? After all, he was linked to Durham Cathedral, which had founded Durham University. And that may well have been his ultimate aim. Having said all that, I have to ask myself whether Burgess, and I think Llewelyn after him, was thinking of Lampeter, if you like, as an aggregate of grammar schools with a prominent divinity class, the focus on divinity. What was in Llewellyn's mind? I don't find that clear either. What institution did he really think he was running? I wonder whether Brown's words, the master of a grammar school, were not that wide of the mark. Something more than a grammar school, less than a university. But someone who had been master of the schools of Oxford should have had a clearer idea. The other reason advanced against Williams was that Harford thought him too fond of the rod and the gun and country sports. And in fact, Rice Rees says that when John Williams was headmaster of the school, he was off quite a lot of his time, either shooting or fishing or not being there, unlike Eleazar. But I think there's another reason. Williams had to leave Winchester because his teaching methods and his harsh discipline caused such offense to pupils that the school erupted in riot. And I find it difficult that Burgess, who was himself a Wycomist, was not aware of this. So Williams leaves Lampeter in 1824 and up to be the first rector of Edinburgh Academy, but he didn't give up his parish until he succeeded Thomas Bynon as Archdeacon of Cardigan in 1833. And he kept hold of that, a sinecure, while at Edinburgh and at Llandovery until his death in 1858. That's a very 18th century trajectory as well. Absenteeism, sinecurism, pluralism, and a lasting bitterness on Williams's part against the college, against Thirlwall, against Llewellyn. Llewellyn succeeded him as vicar of Lampeter and was anything but an absentee. In fact, I think he was a very present and a very devoted incumbent incumbent, and he wanted to be buried here in Lampeter, in the parish churchyard, and not in St David's. And I think at this point, I'll just note one thing, that's his gravestone. I hope you'll all make a pilgrimage to see it. He's there, so is his wife, Carolyn Smith, as was. His two sons, look at the names, very evocative. David Jones Llewellyn, the elder, who at that time, I think he was at Jesus College for a short time. Nobody knows why he left. Probably intended to follow his father into the church. Instead, he goes into the militia and becomes the superintendent of police in Usk. That's why he's got the crown on his shoulders. And then his George, we've already come across, George Smith Llewellyn, after the other grandfather. George is quite a sad, he never made much of himself. He was known as Professor George Llewellyn, but that was because he took private pupils. He'd gone out to Canada and done quite well there as schoolmaster. But there's a series of correspondence I've just come across them recently in the Basil Jones collection, where several colonial bishops are telling Basil Jones why they hadn't ordained George to the priesthood. So he was certainly a deacon. He may have remained a deacon all his life. Now, according to his daughter, back a bit, you have to realize that Oliver became a bishop, Brown became a bishop, Brown became a bishop. His last vice principal, Davy, became the Dean of Llandaff. Roland Williams, had he lived, would undoubtedly, I think, have been the first Welshman on the bench for a very, very long time. And had he not published what he did, he would have done, but not Llewellyn. Now, according to his daughter, his relative Lord Carrington, who owned land in Llandovery, as I've said, had commended him to Lord Melbourne, then the Prime Minister. When, however, he discovered that Llewellyn was a rabid Tory, Melbourne refused to contemplate having him anywhere near the House of Lords. He had too many of them there already. Now, the only Welsh bishopric that I can see that came up in Melbourne's time as Prime Minister was in 1835 and 1841 St David's. St Asaph came up, of course, because at that point in the early 1830s onwards, the plan was to unite Bangor and St Asaph. And also people forget that the other plan was to unite Llandaff, Gloucester and Bristol. So there would have been, I think, 2 bishops in Wales. Well, anyway, the only Welsh record was this one. And did John Morgan, in his 4 biographical sketches, have in mind either Llewellyn or John Williams as, I quote, the classical scholar who had access to the dispensers of power, but his orbit in maturer life had been so eccentric that neither was his promotion desired. The test for you to go away and think about that and come back and tell me. Whatever happened, Llewellyn stayed in Lampeter and was obviously a very good teacher, and he was beloved by his pupils, hence the portrait. They resolved, after the college was granted the privilege of awarding the BD degrees, to commission this portrait from H.W. Pickersgill, and 228 of them raised £260. The portrait cost £120, and the rest went to a silver epergne. Does that still survive, I wonder? Because there was a row over this. It was supposed to hang here, and Llewellyn insisted it go to his house. And in his will, he allows it to come back in here, but it says he has to be on the right-hand side of Bishop Burgess, which of course he is. So Llewellyn as principal. And given that it was not until the end of the century that the letters, the contents of Brown's letters to Thirlwall became public, Kitchen's biography of Brown comes out in 1895. So Ewan Morgan uses it in 1929. But when the book came out, both Owen Alexander Nares, who was Mrs. Nares' husband, son-in-law, and Bishop Basil Jones, attacked it very hard for what it said about Llewellyn. And as we saw, though Llewellyn had taken note of what Brown had said and had changed matters. And it could also be said that the major issue, the responsibility for the condition of the college, wasn't his directly, but the visitor who held absolute and ultimate power. Both Jenkinson and Thirlwall bear responsibility here. Neither had drawn up any statutes of the college. That had to wait until Basil Jones in 1879. So what about the accusations then against Llewellyn of pluralism, syndicalism, absenteeism, and being rapacious when money was concerned? Well, the first thing to say is that this college was endowed in a very, very primitive manner. The advowsons of 6 parishes in the diocese were given to it, not the cash income, not the stipend, but with the right to appoint a vicar. So it's not surprising that they themselves served the cures, both Holland and Llewellyn served Llangera and Llewellyn served Lampeter. Unlike John Williams here, he was resident. He regularly took service, especially Holy Communion services. And also, mind you, this was the church appropriated to the precentorship of St. David's Cathedral. And I wonder whether Llewellyn had some hand in his own appointment as precentor to be able to secure both the vicar rectorial and the vicarial tithes. He farmed the Bryn, as I said, as vicar. And he remained as precentor on the old foundation at a stipend of £200, not the 600 to which he was entitled as dean following the Act of 1840. And he was not technically a pluralist, I do make that point, since his benefices were this exception here, they were cathedral prebends, and they do not carry cure of souls. Pluralism is when you have lots of parishes which actually have got cure of souls. And the other thing he did, he was resident here, but he used his best students as unofficial curates. He mentored them. It's, if you like, it's an early form of placement and mentoring. Indeed, one of the people that he did that who turned out very well, and that was William Williams, later Dean of St. David's. He also rebuilt Lampeter Church, not once, but twice. The second time, R.J. Withers' splendid present parish church, he also granted a part of the glebe of the Bryn. And of course, as I've noted, he and his family are buried, so I haven't noted. Those two are his nephews. And certainly William, the one on the right, as you're looking at it, looks more like the David Jones side of the family, and his father certainly did. Sorry, not William, Charles Lloyd Llewellyn. And the other one, Richard Price Llewellyn, was here at Llewellyn's side when he died in 1878. But at the laying of the foundation stone, by Mrs. Harford, Llewellyn came forward and in Welsh, and he presumably spoke Glamorgan Welsh, but obviously understood by his parishioners, he explains to the non-English people present what Mrs. Harford has just said and done. There was nothing wrong at all with his Welsh. In fact, I've recently come across an exchange of doggerel, really, between him and Bishop Basil Jones in Welsh. It's not great poetry, but you know, it makes the point. He used to preside at local Eisteddfodau and address the audience in Welsh. He took Welsh services in the parish church. Indeed, in St. David's, he was blamed by Nathaniel Davies that the English congregation was being neglected. That's changed. And under his decanate, the south transept of the cathedral was transformed into a parish church for the Welsh congregation. And I also suspect that Lady Llanover's strictures against Llewellyn and his hatred of Welsh were more to do with her fanatical support for Iolo Morgannw's vision of Wales, Iolo's vision of Wales and Welsh culture, than on contemporary, the real Welsh culture as it's stood in the 1830s and 40s. After all, Llewellyn felt at home in it. He'd won the prize for Welsh of Jesus, and he'd shown in 1825, he had shown interest in applying the chair of Welsh in this college. We can also, I think, in this context, ask what had people like Thomas Bynum and Daniel V in mind when the college was founded? Was it meant to be a university on the lines of Llewelyn Lewellin's romantic vision of a University of Wales and teaching his version of Welsh history and culture. And more than that, training the Flaminiad and the Arch-Flaminiad for the Bangors of Iolo's imagination. The other issue that he's looking at is Llewellyn's health. I think this was taken on the occasion of around his 80th birthday and part of a huge montage of bishops and former students. His health had always been precarious. He said that in public in Lampeter. His father was advised not to send him to Oxford, and that he was told when he came to Lampeter he'd be dead in 5 years. He often refers to his ill health. A lot of his correspondence now is in his wheelchair, and the other daughter, Frances, is wheeling him, and she died in her 30s. And as you can see, he's got this enormous growth on his nose in that photograph. But he was over 80 when he died, and the equally delicate son George was also nearly 80 when he died. Llewellyn was no ivory tower scholar, I think that's very clear, but acknowledged as the best Greek scholar in Wales of his day. And he played so many parts in the culture, administrative and social life of Lampeter and district. And that, I think, is key to how he viewed the world. He built a church school in Lampeter, it's still there. He was twice Portree mayor under before the Municipal Reform Act, chair of the Poor Law Union, magistrate, chair of the bench in Lampeter and Aberdaron. He was on the bench a fortnight before he died, the sort of thing which the gentry did. In fact, he was teaching his Greek class 2 days before he died. And all of this is a description of him as the king of Lampeter, as his daughter calls him. His commitment to his duties as he conceived them to be, locally and in the district and in the college, leads me to the conclusion that we should not look at him, say like Jowett, as a pioneering educator of the age of Victoria, or a dean like Dean Stanley, but like a Tavy Valley squarsman, like his Jones and Bowen and Lloyd relatives. And in an obituary, a local newspaper caught it, called him a country gentleman. I think that sums him up. I think that he's a Trollopian figure like Archdeacon Grantley. He may not have been the son of a bishop, but he was the grandson of one similar as David Jones Llangan. Now, this is among the last of the portraits ever taken of him. That's the close-up. The person standing behind him is his last vice principal, Delaware Davy. And he's either so fragile he's sitting on the chair sideways, or he's doing that Victorian thing, this is my best side. I got my mind up. There he is in his library. No, it isn't. It's one of these painted backgrounds. And that is the only relic which I have ever come across of Llewellyn's. At the 175th anniversary service in the cathedral, I was dean then, I carried it in procession. And the irony is, he was a very small man. He was known as a Dr. Bach, and it just about suits me. It's what's carved, all his achievements are on it, but also is the text on which John Williams preached from Malachi at the laying of the foundation stone. Diolch yn fawr.